This is a Fulcrum Side Quest Minisode. Short, focused opinions on psychology and storytelling, personal reflections, unscripted thoughts, maybe even some of your suggestions. Here's Fulcrum.
Welcome to Side Quests, a minisode series from Dark Character Profiler. These are the detours, the hidden trails off the main path where we explore the overlooked, the unexpected, and real-world psychological echoes. Let's get into today's side quest. Today's side quest minisode is going to be a little bit different. Instead of a minisode, we're doing a side quest special. Normally, we explore fictional villains, anti-heroes, and morally complex characters from across media. But today, we're stepping briefly into the real world, not to relitigate a case, but to look at the psychology behind one of the most debated confessions in modern American history. This episode isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about how the human mind behaves under pressure and how factors like fatigue, fear, and authority can shape the words someone speaks in an interrogation room. This is Jessie Misskelley and the West Memphis Three, The Psychology of a Confession. Listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussion of violent crime and interrogation tactics. Context and background. In May of 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas was a small conservative community dealing with fear, grief, and widespread anxiety. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, disappeared after riding their bikes near an area called Robin Hood Hills. Their bodies were discovered the next day. The crime scene was chaotic and deeply disturbing. And because this happened during the peak of the early 90s satanic panic, the investigation quickly took on a moral and cultural dimension. 3 teenagers became the focus: Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. Jessie was 17 years old. He had no criminal history and was described by many who knew him as quiet, compliant, and eager to please. Psychological testing later placed him around an IQ of 72, a range called borderline intellectual functioning, meaning he could understand day-to-day life but might struggle with complex reasoning, memory under stress, or legal comprehension. Within hours of being brought to the police station, Jessie confessed to the murders, but the circumstances of that confession and its reliability have been debated ever since. The interrogation. On June 3, 1993, detectives arrived at Jessie's home around 9 a.m. They told his father they wanted to ask Jessie some questions. Jessie went voluntarily. At the station, he was given a polygraph exam, and then he was told he failed. A form of false feedback often used in questioning, even though polygraph results are not legally reliable. From there, the interrogation continued for many hours. Different sources describe the duration differently, but most agree that it lasted roughly 12 hours, with only 46 minutes being tape recorded. That means the majority of what was said that day, including how details were introduced, repeated, or corrected, isn't preserved. When the recorder finally switched on, the confession contained several contradictions. The first, Jessie described the crime as occurring in the morning, though evidence showed it happened in the evening. Second, he said the victims were tied with rope, when in fact they were tied with shoelaces. And third, he mentioned 2 victims when there were 3. Each time he gave an incorrect detail, Detectives supplied or corrected information, and Jessie changed his answers to match it. This is a pattern psychologists recognize as interrogative suggestibility, which is the tendency to give answers that match an authority figure's cues, especially when tired, anxious, or confused. The mind at risk. Jessie's cognitive profile makes this especially important. People with borderline intellectual functioning are not unintelligent, but they often 1. Have difficulty handling stress, 2. Struggle with complex or rapid changing information, 3. Want to please authority figures, and 4. May not fully understand the consequences of their statements. When a person like this is questioned for many hours without a lawyer or a guardian present, their ability to resist pressure decreases significantly. Research by psychologist Saul Hassan shows that people in this state of mind may give a coerced, compliant confession, saying something false simply to end the situation. In the most extreme situations, some even begin to believe the story they are being told, creating what's known as a coerced internalized confession. We cannot know Jessie's internal experience that day, but the conditions were ideal for psychological distress and confusion. Trial and consequences. In 1994, Jessie was tried separately from his co-defendants. Despite the contradictions in his confession, it was the backbone of the prosecution's case. He was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Years later, in 2007, new DNA testing did not link Jessie, Damien, or Jason to the crime scene. In 2011, the 3 men were released using an Alford plea, which is a legal mechanism that allows a defendant to plead guilty while maintaining innocence. It avoids a retrial and acknowledges that legally the state had enough evidence to convict. Again, this plea does not determine guilt. It is a legal compromise. Listener insight, the Bible confession, and the bottle. After my minisode about meeting attorney, now judge, Dan Stidham, someone left a thoughtful comment raising several points. Rather than ignore those questions, I want to address them directly and in a neutral, fact-based way. Let's explore them one at a time. The whiskey bottle detail. In one of Jesse's later statements, he mentioned that a whiskey bottle would be found near the crime scene. Some sources identify the brand as Evan Williams. A bottle of that brand was indeed found at some point, though not during the initial search and not in a way that linked it to the crime itself. This detail has created debate. Some believe it shows Jessie knew something only the perpetrator would know. Others argue the detail could have come from earlier conversations, suggestions during questioning, or simply been a coincidence. And it's important to note, just because the bottle was present does not mean Jessie wasn't fed the information, nor does it mean the bottle was connected to the crime. Objects can exist in a wooded area for long periods of time. There is no forensic evidence tying that bottle to the crime, the victims, or any suspect. The Bible confession. A year later, Jessie reportedly reaffirmed parts of his confession while holding or swearing on a Bible. This moment is sometimes portrayed as proof of honesty. However, context is important. Jessie had been in custody for months. He was under constant legal and social pressure. and he had previously learned that confessing made the questioning stop. In psychology, this is called compliance reinforcement, repeating a behavior because it previously brought relief, even if the behavior isn't in the person's best interest. This doesn't tell us whether the confession was true or false, only that reaffirmation can be influenced by earlier experiences. Jessie isn't as dumb as Dan claims. A listener pointed out that Jessie might not be as cognitively limited as defense attorney Dan Stidham suggested, and it's a fair question. Let's look at what the records show. According to court testimony, Jessie underwent 2 psychological evaluations before his arrest. The first IQ test was administered in 1989, when Jessie was approximately 13 or 14 years old. The second test took place in 1992. Jessie was around 16 or 17, and this occurred right before the investigation. Both tests placed his full IQ score in the low 70s range, with occasional peaks up to the high 80s on individual subtests. This means Jessie had the ability to function in daily life and communicate casually, but he was vulnerable when faced with complex reasoning, legal concepts, or high-pressure environments like police interrogations. Psychologist Gisli Gudjonsson, an expert in confession psychology, has shown that suggestibility isn't strictly about intelligence. Even someone with average intelligence can give unreliable or false statements under stress, fatigue, or pressure from authority figures. In Jessie's case, his developmental age during testing, early to mid-teens, combined with his cognitive profile and emotional compliance, put him at increased risk for yielding to pressure during prolonged questioning. So the issue isn't whether Jessie was quote-unquote smart or dumb. It's whether he was cognitively vulnerable, especially compared to trained interrogators who controlled the environment, the narrative, and the pace. Why Dan Stidham continued to represent Jessie. Dan Stidham has consistently said that his belief in Jessie's innocence was not based on a single fact, but on the overall inconsistency between Jessie's statements and the actual evidence. His position was based on 1. Contradictions between the confession and the autopsy findings, 2. Timeline problems, 3. Lack of forensic evidence, 4. Jessie's cognitive vulnerability, and 5. Later DNA results. Whether someone agrees with Stidham or not, his position comes from analyzing the evidence as a whole. These questions about the bottle, the Bible statement, and Jessie's cognitive ability reflect how complicated this case is. They don't point to a clear answer. Instead, they highlight how small details can shape big opinions, especially in emotionally charged cases. The language of persuasion. There's a phrase commonly used in police interrogations: help yourself by helping us. To be clear, this exact phrase is not confirmed in the available transcript of Jessie's interrogation. However, it represents a very common interrogation technique called minimization. Minimization makes a situation sound less serious and encourages the person to cooperate by implying things will quote-unquote go easier if they do. For someone who is tired, scared, or confused, especially someone with limited cognitive resources, this kind of language can feel like a lifeline. It can create the sense that confessing is the only way to make the pressure stop. It does not explicitly promise leniency, which is why the tactic is widely used. But psychologically, people often hear it as a promise. This technique doesn't tell us whether the confession is true or false. It simply shows how language and authority can influence behavior when someone feels trapped or overwhelmed. Forensic reflection. From a psychological standpoint, Jessie's confession contains many of the risk factors commonly associated with unreliable or contaminated statements, such as 1. Long duration of questioning, 2. Most of the interrogation unrecorded, 3. His young age, 4. Lack of legal counsel or guardian, 5. Cognitive limitations, 6. Incorrect details that were corrected by detectives, 7. High pressure to comply, and 8. Feedback about the polygraph. None of this proves the confession was true or false, but it does raise valid questions about its reliability. Research consistently shows when people feel scared, isolated, or exhausted, especially when authority figures present themselves as the only route to safety, their ability to think clearly changes. Memory becomes less reliable, and the desire to escape becomes stronger than the desire for accuracy. That is the psychological core of this case. Broader meaning. In fiction, we often see characters pushed to their psychological limits. But cases like this remind us that the human mind is vulnerable in the real world too. This episode isn't about proving guilt or innocence. It's about understanding how pressure, fear, and suggestion can shape a confession, and why psychologists and legal experts look at process, not just outcome. Thank you for joining me for this side quest special. The goal here wasn't to take a side or to decide the outcome of a decades-old case. It was to explore the psychological conditions that can affect confession reliability, the same lens we use when analyzing fictional characters, but applied here to real human behavior. If you found this meaningful, share it with someone who studies the mind, someone who works in criminal justice, or someone curious about the psychology behind confessions. Stay curious, stay analytical, and remember, even the strongest mind can bend when it's placed under pressure.
That's it for today's Side Quest. If you have any topic suggestions, send us an email at darkcharacterprofiler@gmail.com. Don't forget, Dark Character Profiler returns next week. Thank you for listening.